All right. Welcome to the Lovecraft Easing podcast. My guest today is Scott Nicolay. Hey, Scott.
Hola.
Haven't had you on in a while, so I'm happy to see you.
I'm
So,
happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
and we have Matt Carpenter here and Rick Lay here. Why don't you guys do quick introductions? And Matt, I think you have a prize, so why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay, yeah, there is a prize this week. Just so you know, there's no Lovecraft Easing movie night this coming Saturday because of Thanksgiving festivities.
All right.
But our prize is a really wonderful collection by Scott Thomas called Vale of the White Horse, some of his British stories. He is a wonderful writer if you've never read his work. To try and win this book, send an email to easingprizes@gmail.com, put Vale in the subject heading. We draw a winner in about 6 weeks. You've got plenty of time to get your entry in. Maybe you'll get this book.
Yeah, that's Scott Thomas's newest book. So, and it contains some of his previous stories. I think some new ones too. Can't remember for sure. But yeah. Rick.
Rick Lay, writer and pulp magazine collector.
And Pulp Fiction Award winner. The Muncie Award, right?
Right. Also was an interest in French literature, of pulp literature, which Scott will talk about later.
Yes, I heard you mention that when I walked away earlier. So that's great. Yeah, you can lob a lot of questions at Mr. Nicolay here. So Scott, for those out there who don't know who you are, I doubt there are many, but for those who don't, can you introduce yourself?
Okay, I didn't know I was going to have to do that. Yeah, so I'm
You can
an
just say I'm
author.
Scott Nicolay and leave it up there if you want to.
Yeah, I'm an author. My second collection of fiction came out in April from Word Horde. It's called "And at My Back." I always hear here. I conveniently have a copy.
I'm glad they gave you one.
It looks like, why am I backwards?
Oh, you're not. It just looks that way to you.
That way to me. Maybe I never held up a book on Zoom before or something. And I've also been translating and editing the work of the Belgian writer Jean Ray. So I've edited 6 books and translated 5 of them. The one novel, Malpurtius, that we were talking about before, that we published a translation, excellent translation that was only published in the UK. So I just edited that. There's a 6th one that hasn't come out yet that I translated.
Yeah, you sent me 3 of them, and they're just absolutely wonderful. We'll get into that. You also edited a book recently called Research into Marginal Living, the Selected Stories of John D. Kefauver, if I'm saying his name right.
Yeah, there we go. That one too.
Yeah, by the way,
this is sort of a life. I've been working on this for like over 40 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I read in your introduction when you first sent him a letter, he said, you can do this only if I don't have to do anything at all. And by the way, you're 25 years too late.
Yeah, that's what he said.
So it's an interesting story on how you got it done. So we'll get to that too. Just to remind everyone, if you are a patron, I really appreciate it because you guys are the engine that keeps Lovecraft Easing running. Truly, I couldn't do it without the Patreons. You know, that's not just something I say, it's literally true. So thank you. You know, there's different levels. At $5 you get all the Patreon podcasts, and at $10 and up there's several different awards where you get several different neat things, and I'm always given little extras that aren't really mentioned in the tiers, like a free book, you know, or a free audio, you know, from the Historical Society with their permission, that sort of thing I do. So just go to patreon.com/lovecrafteasing or Google Lovecraft Easing Patreon. So
I heard you randomly send out cursed objects like haunted dolls.
I try to. I pick someone at random. A lot of the time they end up at Matt Carpenter's door, you know. So for example, we have this cute little emoji guy here. Yes, it is cursed. Well, this one is not cursed. I haven't cursed it yet. But it was in the background a while back. It and another one was in the background a while back. I forget who. I think my son gave me these. And so they probably are cursed. He probably cursed them and gave them to me. And Matt's like, "What is that in the background? Um, that's so freaky looking." I'm like, "Freaky looking? It's an emoji." For those who are listening later, I'm holding up a yellow emoji and he's sleeping. You know, he's got the ZZZ going above his head. So I sent one to Matt just to. I'm surprised you don't display it on the behind you.
You crazy kids and your innovations and stuff.
Yeah, I know. I know.
If you sent me something on papyrus, I might get around to looking at it.
Matt's first question was, "What's an emoji?" Yeah. So anyway, thank you to all my patrons, and if you're not a patron, you too might occasionally get a cursed object. So you know, it you don't have to send that much, but a lot of people giving $5 or $10 a month adds up to a lot of help. I was on Wikipedia today to refresh my memory on Jean Ray, and they're doing a little fundraiser, and which they occasionally have to do because they don't take on advertising. And you could give like a couple bucks, or you could sign up to give a small amount or a large amount if you're rich. I'm not per month on Wikipedia. And I thought, you know what? This is an invaluable resource that I use all the time. How can I not at least send them a little bit something each month? And let's just say I'm below middle class in the financial aspect of things, but you know, sending them $5 a month, I'm not going to miss. And if a bunch of people do that for Wikipedia, it helps them too. So it's the same sort of thing. You know, I thought I get a lot out of Wikipedia. I just can't keep not giving them any money. It just feels wrong. You know, if it's something I used once a year, that'd be different. But so anyway, Scott, as you said, just recently released another book, a collection, and At My Back I Always Hear. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about something that hasn't gotten a lot of press. Several things, and the first is Jean Ray's the translations he's done of Jean Ray's work. For example, these are beautiful books. Cruise of Shadows. I'll link to these in the comment in the show notes. I think this one's Circles of Dread.
Oh, good. I'm glad you have that.
But actually, could I ask, when you
Yes.
do this discussion, Scott, could you go and say like how you heard of this author, why you thought they were important, and what led you particular to do the translations? I'd kind of like to hear some background on him because he was unfamiliar to me, you know?
Yeah. I said that I was on the phone with Scott last night, and I said, years ago, like at Necronomicon and such, you'd always mention Jean Ray. It would come up, how great of a writer he was of weird fiction, and I had never heard of him either at the time. And then when I read these translations, I'm like, man, I get it. This is absolutely phenomenal stuff. I started reading Cruise of Shadows when you sent that to me a year or so back, Scott, and I'm like, holy cow. I'm glad he translated these. So it's basically weird fiction that was not available until Scott did this for English-speaking readers. So do you want to start with that? As Matt said, the background and how you got interested in then how this all came about?
Sure.
I promise we'll talk about your book too.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, Jean Ray is important. I've spent more time on Jean Ray in the last 6 or 7 years than in my own writing, I think.
Yeah.
So about 25, 30 years ago, I had a dream and some angels appeared to me, and I'm kidding.
I knew it would start this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if the late John Palin, who was
it Gabriel? That asshole's always bothering me.
They never tell you their names. They just blow the horn real freaking loud, and then after you're kind of deafened.
And they yell, "Be not afraid," after they scare the shit out of
you. Biblically accurate angels. So so John Palin was an early mentor to me, and back in the early days of the the World Wide Web and the internet, where our social media was news groups. I was on a news group back in the 90s or mid 90s, maybe. I think it was called Rec Arts Ghost Fiction. And, there were some people that I got to know on there that were writers I liked. So Palin was on there, and Brian McNaughton. I don't know if anybody remembers Brian McNaughton.
Sure.
I talk about an underrated
A
vocalist.
fabulous writer. Gosh, he was.
Yeah. Sad that he's gone. And others. And Palin, I forget what the context was, but there were several writers that he would mention that were very obscure. I mean, Aikman was one that I learned from him too, and Aikman was pretty obscure. Had fallen into obscurity by then, by the 90s. Now he's had somewhat of a revival. And Jean Ray, and I had some exchange with him about Jean Ray. And of course, we'd never met or anything. He offered to send me what he called his beater copy of Ghouls in My Grave, which is the 1964 translation of a group of Jean Ray stories by Voltaire. And so he did. And it was that's still a rare book. It costs about $100 on average to find a copy of that. And he sent me that. And the only thing he asked is that if I ever passed it on, I'd give it away, not try to sell it. And which I eventually did after, it was completely falling apart at that point. But so he sent me that, and that was my introduction to Jean Ray. And I was blown away because these stories, were published in the 60s, and they were quite bit older, the original French versions by then. And it seemed so fresh. At the time in the 90s, I was really deeply focused on reading weird fiction and noir. And I had some idea of going to grad school and doing a thesis or a PhD on the noir writing as sort of a unique American tragic vision equivalent to Elizabethan tragedy. So I was reading those two categories extensively.
Excuse me for jumping in, but isn't it interesting how those two genres, weird fiction and noir, seem to go together in so many ways?
They do. There's a line by Jim Thompson. I was actually about to mention another context. Who wrote The Killer Inside Me, which Stephen King called the Great American Novel, and it's a justifiable case. And I actually written an essay. I think it's on the Vandermeer's Weird Fiction Review site where I mentioned this quote. But I return to this quote again and again because he said there are 37, maybe it's 27, 37 ways, an arbitrary number, 37 ways to tell a story, and I've used every one of them. But there is only one plot. Things are not what they seem. And I think if you look at noir and weird fiction from that perspective, they're just different levels or approaches to the same question. In noir, what's not what you think it is your personal relationships, your relationships with society, the government, corporations, etc. In weird fiction, it's your relation with the food chain or the cosmos. And it's just a different approach, and they can easily be blended, obviously. And I think hard-boiled and noir are two completely different things. Hard-boiled is sort of the cartoon version of noir.
Yeah, for example, the Spencer series would be hard-boiled and maybe action, and I mentioned Matthew Scudder a lot, would be more noir. Of course, that's just one example of many. So yeah, I
Not
agree.
to knock people that are doing hard-boiled stuff, but I think real noir is something else that continues very strongly today with a lot of writers and filmmakers too. But a whole renaissance of film.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I always saw those two as connected. When I read Jean Ray, one thing that struck me in Ghouls in My Grave, the first story in there is a story called Dentor, or Gold Teeth. And it was like reading Jim Thompson channeling Poe. And that really hit me. And it seemed so fresh. I mean, these stories were old, I mean, that book came out the year after I was born, but they seemed so fresh. It was fresher than a lot of the stuff I was reading at the time. I was just blown away by that, and all through the book. And then you get to the really bonkers novellas, the main Salter and the Gloomy Alley, which Barrett translated as the Shadowy Street.
Great
I mean,
story.
yeah, I mean the main Salter particularly is just absolutely bonkers. It's like
I think I'm echoing in your speakers a bit. You might want to can you turn down your speakers a bit? See if that's
sure.
the problem. Or if you have earbuds. But anyway, what I was going to say was this kind of all begs the question. Yeah, that's better. This begs the question of you talking about how fresh they are and that they were old even at the time in 64. For the audience member out there, they're probably thinking right now, so when did John Ray write these weird fiction stories?
He started, his first collection was Whiskey Tales, was 1925.
Okay.
And, you know, he continued writing up until fairly late, but most of the stories that we're talking about were written between 1925 and maybe the end of World War II.
Okay.
I haven't, the stuff after World War II, I think I haven't gotten to that yet. Well, you know, we haven't gotten the publisher. There's still several collections.
Yeah. Matt, is that cover your questions on background, or you?
Yeah, I was just sort of interested, like you say, this is someone I had no knowledge of, and so like suddenly we have this new author available. I'm kind of interested how you got to know about him. So thanks.
Yeah, so it was Palin, you know, the late John Palin. I owe him that debt, and he, over the years, we had some discussions, and I got in around 1999, 2000, somewhere around there. I got back, and actually, no, it was more recent, maybe 2008, somewhere around there. I recontacted him because that bulletin board, I don't know if news group thing, I don't know if it even existed anymore, but I got back in touch with him. It turned out he was living 90 miles away from me.
Wow.
You know, he gave me his phone number, said call him, and I'm like, wait, that's a New Mexico phone number. And he was living in Gallup, Shiprock. It's literally short, you know, for New Mexico, a short ride. And so I went down. We started hanging out, and we talked. We always talked about we'd go out and, you know, have dinner, shoot pool, stuff like that. And he'd always talk about, you know, or we'd always talk about Jean Ray. And you know, I threw out the idea that maybe I could try translating some of those, since I, you know, had some background in French. And it was sort of a wild idea at the time. I'm amazed that how much I've actually done, because I think the amount would have been daunting to me at the time.
Matt has said many times on this show that there's so much weird fiction, cosmic horror, and so forth, you know, strange weird fiction stories in other languages that we don't even know about, and would, you know, would love to read if we did know about them, if they were translated. I
Yeah,
really feel that you've done a really great service here to
that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I'm trying to make a contribution, and I just feel he's a really important writer, and people seem to be enjoying them and recognize it. So, and if I brought him across into English in a way that still carries some of that freshness that I felt, you know, then I'm really happy. It's a success.
Just to add one thing about John Ray, he wrote great horror fiction, but that didn't put food on the table. So he was also a pulp writer of forgettable detective stories. He did a series called Harry Dixon. I don't think he created. I think he inherited it.
It's sort of a complicated story, because there was a publisher who got the rights to a German series of Sherlock Holmes knockoff stories.
Yes.
And they came with the covers, like these beautiful covers, and, you know, from some pulp magazine. And they contracted John Ray and to write to translate them, and he started translating them, and they were so awful that he said, just let me write new stories, completely new stories. So he had to write stories, but they had to fit the covers.
Mhm.
So he wrote, over 100. I think it's not totally clear how many of them he wrote, because like the Hardy Boys, other people picked them up after him. There was more than one writer, but he
When I
brought
was
it
a kid, I
across.
was amazed at how many books Franklin W. Dixon wrote.
Yeah, or Carolyn Keene with Nancy Drew. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so you see those old Harry Dixon books, they don't actually have an author on this.
Right. Harry Dixon just was supposedly an American who had been trained by Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, it's called the American Sherlock Holmes, and those stories are very, very pulpy. They're really gonzo.
Yeah, it
I
being
don't.
repeated by a company called Black Coat Press in new translations,
Yeah, I don't see myself.
but they're very inferior to his horror writing.
In general, I would say so. Yeah,
Yeah, I was going to ask, because
they're very popular.
you're a pulp fiction expert, Rick, and I was going to ask how do they rate, how do his pulp stories rate in general? Sounds like not very high.
So it's I mean, it's like going from Lovecraft to Nick Carter. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Got to put food on the table, though, right?
Yeah, I would say Lynn Carter is maybe not the same style but yeah, something.
Nick Carter, I said.
Oh, Nick Carter, Lynn Carter would
in the detective series.
fit. There are sometimes some of the ones I've specifically the Harry Dixon stories I've looked at when I'm annotating the horror stories or the weird fiction stories. He often used motifs, characters in more than one story, and did different versions of them. And so sometimes, like the novel that I just translated that hasn't come out yet, the City of Unspeakable Fear, La Cité d'Indicible Peur. That one, there is a Harry Dixon story that includes some of the same characters and settings, and but it goes in a completely crazy multiple directions, and the shifts in some of these Harry Dixon stories are wild.
What book number is that?
That'll be the 6th one when it comes out.
Yeah, it looks like I've got
Yeah, that one's not out yet, so
2, 3, and 4, I think.
It's a forthcoming one.
Yeah. No, I think I still need 1 and 5. So yeah. I mean, I love these books, and they're for those who can't see, they're very beautiful, soft cover books too. Great covers.
yeah, the publisher came up with an interesting approach to the cover, which I think is working really well. Which the images are decayed film stock from a library of images of decayed film stock. So they're old
Wow.
film cells from I don't know how 100 years ago or something that have rotted. And they're not just chosen at random. If you look at each cover, you can see how it fits some part of the book.
Yeah.
So he's done a beautiful job of that, and they're so weird, and creepy. I think
yeah, they're sort of unsettling, and you don't know why when you see them.
Yeah.
You just get that unsettling feeling. They're also available in Kindle for those of you who are out there who are Kindle people, want to start reading it right away. This is just a personal observation of the 3 I have. I really loved Cruise of Shadows the best. So my suggestion is start with that one, but others might disagree. So
yeah, I think that's his masterpiece.
Oh, okay.
I think it's one of the greatest collections of single author weird fiction, published as a single collection from the last century, and ever for that matter. But we have a flood of great stuff in this century, just in the last 10 years. But
sounds like I'm on point. And of course, I will include that in the show notes as well, the link to that book. How challenging was this for you, Scott, to translate these, and how stressful wanting to get it just right.
It is a complicated process because I way back, and I don't know how long this was, maybe 10 years ago, I just did one story. It's one I mentioned in a thing I wrote for you on Lovecraft Easy a while back when you had me do like my 5 favorite weird stories or something. I mentioned a story called The Centipede, La Scolopendre. It actually has a typo in the title in French. It's infamous for that. And it's about a group of college students basically sitting Shiva on a dead witch, waiting for her giant familiar, this giant centipede, to show up. And so I translated that one. That was sort of my test case. And then I just started. I got a copy of his first book, the Whiskey Tales, and I started translating those kind of at random at first, then going through systematically from the beginning. And at that time, the main reason you don't have, or we didn't have access to most of Genre's work in English was, and this is a caveat to all authors out there, he didn't leave his estate in good shape. And I believe he left it with his daughter, and it went to a niece at one time. And the niece, I'll just share a story with you that John Palin told me. He said that because he published an edition, a very limited edition of the Genre stories in translation from Midnight House. And when he was publishing those, he was trying to negotiate the rights with the niece, and she wanted royalties on copies sold in used bookstores. So let that, as Elon Musk would say, let that sink in.
Yeah.
And so what Palin eventually did is he sent her a check, and he wrote on the check, cashing this check constitutes acceptance of the terms of the contract I previously signed, which is not going to hold up in court, but it gave him something. She cashed the check, and that was, last he ever interacted with her. I had heard a rumor, at some point I heard a rumor, although I'd already begun translating, that the estate had finally secured a legitimate attorney to handle the rights. So I translated 3 whole books. I translated his first 3 collections. And without any confidence that I'd ever have the rights or ability to publish them. And a friend of mine in France, Christophe Thiel, pointed me to the l'Amicale Genre, the Genre Society, Friends of Genre. And I got in touch with them. I joined. As far as I know, I'm still the only American member. And they connected me with the attorney. There indeed was an attorney. And the attorney said, we have ceded. So I wrote, I labored over this, elaborate letter in French to the attorney. And he immediately responded and said, well, we have ceded the rights to this French publisher. And so I had to write to the French publisher. So then they said, okay, here's our agent. Not like, and it's not like an agent that an author would have. It's their person who handles that department or whatever. So I wrote to that person, and they said, we don't work with translators. We only work with publishers. And another, Edouard Gauvin, really excellent French translator, far above my level, and very productive. He connected me with Wakefield Press. And I talked to them, told them the situation. And they contacted the French publisher. And at that time, I had no guarantee that they were going to retain me to do the translations. I said, look, I would like it if you did. I hope that you will, but maybe you want somebody, with more of a resume field. And they had to eventually bid on the rights because the press wanted to put them up for auction. And he got the rights, and then I started polishing the 3 translations that I had. And this is about 6 years ago, and they've been coming out since then. The third one, I actually lost my file.
Oh man!
I was able to recall some of the stories. Yeah, the long novella, the title novella, I had to retranslate from scratch. Actually, that turned out to be a good thing because I got much more invested in it. translating these things, you go so deep into them, and stories that maybe you read and thought was okay, then when you really when you're going through and translating it, you begin to appreciate all the nuances of it and how complex they are. You see qualities that you missed.
Well, it sounds like I'm on point when I talked about Cruise of Shadows. I can't stress enough just how, if you're a weird fiction fan, and if you're listening to this, I'm assuming you are, just how wonderful these weird fiction stories are. Maybe start with Cruise of Shadows and go from there.
Yeah,
As
I
I
think
said, I'll include the links.
I have a bit of a, not an argument, but discussion with Andre Verbruggen, who's the head of L'École Genre, and he feels that the masterpiece is Les Derniers Contes de Canterbury, the Last Tales of Canterbury, which, if all goes well, will be the next book that I work on. And that's an amazing book, actually. And it's basically a sequel to the Canterbury Tales, with cannibalism and all kinds of crazy stuff.
Of course.
Yeah, and so that's his favorite. And most people say Maupertuis, the novel, is the masterpiece. Either any of those three, Cruise of Shadows, Maupertuis, or the last Canterbury Tales, I think would qualify as a masterpiece. The Cruise of Shadows is just an impeccable weird fiction collection. There's not a dud in it. And the famous stories are the two novellas that have been, that Little Bear translated back in the 60s, The Maid Salter and The Gloomy Alley, aka The Shadowy Street. And those are the ones that they have been, I think Hartwell reprinted them in an anthology once too. And the Vandermeers put them in the weird anthology in Little Bear's translations. The Little Bear's translation of The Maid Salter is missing about a page and a half of the original. But those are the ones that people know, and they're spectacular weird novellas. But there's a suite of like 3 stories in there that kind of tonally at least go together. The End of the Road, Moonshine d'Enfer, and oh gosh,
The End of the Street.
Yeah, okay, The End of the Street. I'm trying to remember what I translated it as.
I'm sure you've got a lot in your head.
Yeah, that was a while ago, and a lot of grad school ago.
I started reading this. It was the first story, The Horrifying Presence, and I was just immediately sucked in. And you're right, there's not a dud in here. You can start
and that,
right at the
if
beginning
anything,
and
if you had to point
continue.
to a story that was not as spectacular, I don't want to say weaker, but that's probably the least of the stories in there, or at least the simplest. And from there, it just goes up.
Right.
Until you get to the end. And one question a lot of people have is, was there any influence between Lovecraft and Ray? I've investigated that in great depth, because it's a question that's really remained unanswered conclusively. They did have stories in one issue of Weird Tales together, and Lovecraft did read Jean Ray's story, published under the name John Flanders, and commented positively. It's not the stories. There were 7 stories that were translated in Weird Tales and other pulp magazines in the 30s, and they're not his best stories. They're not bad, but they're nothing remarkable. Mostly earlier stuff than what we're talking about here. Mostly from the first collection. And the only one that's in Cruise of Shadows is The Last Guest. That was and that's the best of the ones that came out at that time. So Lovecraft read Jean Ray. The Maid Salter, which is the most obviously Lovecraftian, and also explicitly Hodgsonian. He literally rips off one element of Hodgson's The Ghost Pirates in there. There's a scene that's basically straight out of Ghost Pirates. And I had talked to the fellow who passed away a few years ago, who was kind of the Hodgson amateur scholar. He lived in Providence, I think.
Yeah.
And I'd asked him, way back, was Hodgson ever translated into French? And he told me no. He was rather confident about that. But then I found out that indeed the Ghost Pirates was translated into La Revue Belge, which was published by one of Jean Ray's friends. So he definitely read the Ghost Pirates in French. And there was one story, the one with the giant hand, that was translated to Hodgson story. I should remember others. So he read
Well,
Hodgson.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, he definitely read Hodgson, and you can see that in his work. And I don't think he read Lovecraft as such, but I'm pretty. So he wrote the main Salter in prison. He spent 2 years in prison for fraud or something. Probably it's variously described as fraud or embezzlement. He got involved in a sketchy scheme and took the fall for it. Anyway, he wrote the main Salter and the Shadowy Street in prison, and I don't think he read the Call of Cthulhu, but I think someone told him about it, because there are elements in the main Salter that there's this idea of this sort of undersea city with squid monsters that appears briefly in that. So I think he was throwing some of the stuff in the mix there.
Probably thought to himself, well, that sounds interesting. I think I'll use some of that in the story, and went
Yeah.
from there.
The one
Well,
thing I think he may have read by Lovecraft is,
mhm.
and he would not have known it was Lovecraft because it wasn't published under Lovecraft's name until much later, is Imprisoned with the Pharaohs.
Okay.
There are some things I think echo that. And, being as it came under Houdini's name, he might have read that, although he was not fluent. He had some English, but not enough to read fluent.
Well, I want to move on, but before I do, I just want to read the back cover synopsis of Cruise of Shadows to kind of whet the appetite of the listener. Footsteps in an abandoned holiday resort as the cold weather settles in. A door that opens in an empty house. A knock on the door of a hut in the middle of an isolated bog. A lane in Rotterdam perceptible to only one inhabitant of the city. A tavern with no sign serving alcohol on an endless credit that produces no intoxication, promising only the end to an endless street. In Cruise of Shadows, Jean Ray began to fully explore the trappings of the ghost story to produce a new brand of horror tale, one that describes the lineaments of a universe adjacent to this one, an extra-dimensional realm beyond space in which objects sweat hatred and fear, and where the individual must face the unknown in utter isolation. So if that doesn't whet your appetite and cause you to buy this, I don't know what would. So Cruise of Shadows, and then the other ones. And as I said, and I'm not trying to throw an empty compliment out, but I truly do think, Scott, that you've done a great service to especially the weird fiction reading community by translating these stories, making them available more widely, to English readers. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you and other folks are enjoying them. I don't think we can really understand the full breadth of weird fiction in the 20th century without Jean Ray.
Well, that was what I wanted you to talk about next, because you and I talked briefly last night about there are some who think that that weird fiction is more of an American thing, maybe started with American Tales. I forget who you said last night. And I want you to talk about how that's not true, that it goes further back than that with other countries and other languages.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back in French. Well, I mean, we could take it back in English, back to Poe. There's definitely, the narrative of Agord and Pym, for instance.
Right.
And certainly was a big influence on Lovecraft. But yeah, there's a whole school in French. Now, Jean Ray, of course, is not French. He's Belgian. He wrote in French. He also wrote Dutch. And he was he's the preeminent figure of what they call the Belgian school of the strange or the weird. He was sort of the founder of that. But there was J.H. Rosnianier before him in Belgium, writing in French in Belgium.
You wrote The Quest for Fire, right?
Yeah, if you've seen the movie, everybody remembers it for Ray Don Chong being naked through the whole movie, but it's actually a very good movie, and that was one of the things. I translated one of his novellas, the Zipérus, which is about aliens. Well, he never says they're aliens. These strange crystalline beings that suddenly show up in like Mesopotamia or Turkey, somewhere like about 8,000 years ago, like at the very dawn of what we would call civilization, or right before the very dawn. And it becomes a situation where the human beings have to it's either one race is going to annihilate the other, it's a do or die. And it's very, very weird. He also perfectly describes lasers in that story.
No kidding.
Yeah. And these things
Wow.
they're almost exactly like Daleks. It's really bizarre.
I love it.
I mean, I researched this very carefully when Sam Cowan published that from Dim Shores, the translation I did, and to see if I could find any connection with Daleks. And there's a lot of discussion about what the inspiration for Daleks was, but it's one possibility.
Rick, comments?
Alex, I don't have anything to offer. Other than Terry Nation is the creator of the Daleks.
Yeah, there's some reason to believe that he may have read that story. It was translated several other times, but
That's really interesting. That's great.
I wasn't happy with the translation, so I redid it. But yeah, so there's this whole school, and I think really there's been this attitude in the United States and England, I think also, that weird fiction all runs through the Farnsworth Wright era of weird tales. With Lovecraft and Smith.
How can you even make this statement if you think about, like, what about the original Brothers Grimm's fairy tales? Or
unfortunately, there are people who really do think this way. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people. I think for a while those people sort of dominated, just because they were the only ones really maybe doing any kind of scholarship, or at least fan scholarship on weird fiction. And as an aside to that, it's really sad that they ignored the post Farnsworth Wright era of weird tales, because there was some very interesting stuff going on in there. That's where Ray Bradbury started appearing. So, they had a woman editor then, and a lot of women writers. So, and they didn't kill, they didn't kill weird tales. The whole pulp magazine era just ended completely. It went out. But, I always had this feeling, in my teens, I'd been reading Lovecraft since I was 7, and other stuff that I could get a hold of, but fairly early on, I encountered Kafka, and at some level, I always felt that this was satisfying, my interest in the same way that, say, Lovecraft did, or in a similar way. It was hitting a similar spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think a lot of us ever really articulated that until, Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, published the Weird anthology, and they did a simple, elegant, but obvious, what should have been obvious thing. And they included, writers back to Kafka and Bruno Schultz and et cetera, so there's this whole European tradition that is very much weird fiction. And you can place Jean Ray in that tradition as easily as you can in with, Lovecraft and the weird tales. And they also included Asian writers and African writers, and it shows that this tradition's out there. You talk to Mike Kelly. Mike Kelly and I were on a panel at World Fantasy years ago, and he brought up the point that the ancient Japanese folktale, the Bamboo Cutter's Daughter, he sees that as a weird fiction tale, and it's not necessarily what I would go to, but it definitely has elements that you can. I mean, this girl comes out of a flower and she was sent down by the moon. It's pretty wild.
The Vandermeers definitely did something that sometimes the most genius things are simple and obvious.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
They're so obvious maybe that no one's thought of them.
But once they're done, you can't unsee it unless you.
Yes.
I mean, there's people that try to ignore it, but you can't unsee what they did. And
I'll include a link to this too. But to the audience, if you don't have this book, you really need it. The Vandermeer's weird.
It's right behind me. There. This is,
Yep.
I think it's the British edition, but I got it.
There are a lot of stories in there. They're in chronological order. If I remember right, the Vandermeers
Pretty
make
much,
notes
yeah.
on why they included it. Several years ago, Matt Carpenter was kind enough to buy me the Kindle edition, which, as I said to you last night, I for books like this, I really love, because they're searchable and I can highlight things like that. You
Yeah,
know,
it's a damn
so
brick too, but
sorry.
it's a damn brick.
Yes, it is. So the Kindle edition, you know, helps with that as well.
You know, they start. I think they start in a really important place, which is with Alfred Kubin. You know, who is both a weird writer and a brilliant weird artist. And anybody who likes, you know, the art of the Weird Tales era should, if they're not familiar with Kubin's art, should really look at that.
They include a story that I'd always liked by, I think it's H.F. Arnold, and it's the only story anyone knows that this guy ever wrote, and they don't even know if it was a synonym. And the name of the story escapes me, but it's in the weird. It's that story about the guy in the radio.
Yep. I
Yeah.
don't remember the name
The
of the
Nightwire.
story you're talking about.
The Nightwire. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
I love that story, and they included it in there. And this is one guy's claim to fame, for lack of a
Yeah, he
better
wrote.
term.
I think he wrote 2 stories, and it is actually his real name. I've seen a picture of his tombstone online.
Oh, really?
But he just wrote these 2 stories, and the Nightwire is a brilliant freaking story. I mean, there's several things going on in that story, any one of which a lesser writer would have made the whole story out of.
Yeah.
And he crams all that in one. Of course, you know, it's generally credited as the inspiration for Stephen King's The Mist.
Well, and it's brilliant right from the beginning, where he talks about the romance, for lack of a better word, of being up there late at night listening to whispers from around the world of news and things like that. You know, back in the 30s or whenever it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a great story.
By the way, if you read the final novella in my new book, there's a tie-in to the Nightwire.
I have not read the final one yet. No.
Oh, when you get to that, there's a tie.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. That's great. And I'm glad you said something, because even reading it, I might not have known that you did it deliberately. So, without you having said so. So let's talk about your book. There's 8 stories in the book. Tell us about those, and this book just came out a few months ago. Is that right?
Right at the end of April, beginning of May.
Okay. So yeah,
From
tell us about this one. And I know this one is available on Kindle too.
Yeah, word puts those things out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, actually, I'd written a fair amount of this even before the first book came out, and I had about 112,000 words, which is longer than a lot of people's collections. I mean, everybody does different. Some people can do, you know, a great deal in 70,000 words, 60,000 words. But I tend to go long, and I there's certain things I try to do. I try to drive a story through atmosphere and character rather than plot, and let the plot develop organically. It's not to say I don't use plot, but
which is something I love, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I lean into that, you know, and maybe it's not what everybody likes, but every now and then I'll get a review on Amazon or somewhere that says, like, there was one guy, and I had no idea who this was. It wasn't somebody I knew, and it was an anonymous reviewer. It was something like he said some writers, you know, paint a scene or something, but he goes, this guy puts you there, and that's literally what I try to do. That's my goal. So I felt like if I reached that one guy, you know, or it might have been earlier, I don't know.
It reminds me of my ongoing argument with Kelly Young about John Carpenter's The Fog, which I love that movie, and he doesn't hate it, but he's like, this movie has some severe problems which you refuse to see and everything, and I pretend to refuse to see them, but I actually I hear where he's coming from, and he basically says that the story is just all atmosphere, and I think it's all atmosphere and characterization, and yes, maybe a little bit weak on plot, but not to say your stories are, because they're not, but I really it is to say that I really do love stories that are really rich in the atmosphere, rich in the characterization, because that's part of the thing that really, as you say, puts you there.
Yeah.
And
Well,
Jim, go ahead.
People think I hate Lovecraft or something, but I read, or maybe I have that reputation, but I was reading Lovecraft since 1970. He's literally the first author whose stories I ever sought out by name after encountering him. I read the Dunwich Horror in second grade. And the thing I came to understand as I grew older and read more, and eventually majoring in English in college as an undergrad, is that story is heavily driven by atmosphere.
Yeah.
And it's also the opening of that model of that story is very much modeled on the story that Lovecraft thought was the weird story, which is The Willows by Algernon Blackwood.
Another atmospheric rich story.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they both begin with several pages of atmosphere. I mean, what Lovecraft does at the beginning of Dunwich Horrors is brilliant. He does, there's like a whole 2 pages where you're taking this wrong turn and going down this horrible road where the frogs are a little too creepy and everything. And only later do you find out you're in Dunwich. And Blackwood does the same thing in The Willows before he ever introduces the characters.
Yeah, and by the way, I've never gotten the feeling that you hate Lovecraft. I just understand your problems with him, and you know, I have problems with him too as a person. But he wrote some brilliant stories. He wrote some duds.
Yeah,
He
and
wrote some brilliant
the whole
stories.
the controversy with Lovecraft is people wanted him in the canon, and I always thought he should be in the canon. He's in the canon now, but then you need to accept, legitimate criticism. He's once he's in the canon, he's subject to that analysis like any other writer,
Yeah, everybody does.
and you can't
Needs to
shield
be
him from
accepted.
that.
And
And
as
he's
I said
dead.
to you, cosmic horror, Lovecraftian fiction, to me, is a branch, and granted, it's a big branch, but it's a branch on the tree of weird horror, of weird fiction, excuse me. And it's not the tree; it's a branch on the tree, in my mind, anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
It's
I
just one
think
other type of weird fiction.
the fundamental thing for me in writing this, the weird fiction that I've written, and it's not the only thing I write. I write academic articles, etc. But
Mhm.
when I'm writing weird fiction, consciously writing weird fiction, I believe that there is something called the weird exists outside of us. That it literally is what's outside of us. It's a priori to the human species, maybe a priori to the existence of our world. And that's what Lovecraft was trying to get at. He was trying to get at something that was, completely beyond human, beyond our knowledge of space and time. And I try to imagine, or try to not imagine per se. I try to just let myself feel when I'm writing how those things might materialize in our world. What if the weird was real? If there were things that are totally unknowable or totally foreign or alien in the real true sense to our experience, how would they seem? How would we experience those
I love that. And Gemma Files wrote the introduction to this book. I read the back of Cruise of Shadows to whet your appetite, folks, about genre. I'd like to read a little bit of Gemma's introduction to whet your appetite about Scott's book, Scott Nicolay, and At My Back I Always Hear. Nicolay's perspective is always outsider identified, entirely concerned with characters who refuse to settle both literally and figuratively. His protagonists often hover on a knife's edge, caught in some sadly inescapable moment of realization. They've failed and been failed, left discarded among the wreckage of systemic inequity, excuse me. And now they have nothing left to cling to. Their inner eye pops open, suddenly able to see the darkness lurking, inherent in every crevice, the emptiness revolving inside of every atom. And then you've got some Amazon reviews here. I was looking at a couple of them. Scott Nicolay does not disappoint with this collection. The way he writes each story, this is what you were saying earlier, Scott, the way he writes each story transports you there with the characters. With the way Nicolay writes, I was right there with Michael as he waited. I could smell the blood and hear the train as Dumont fought Ratch. I love how he takes real locations that you can actually go to and makes his stories seem like one of the stories made up by one generation passed down to the next. So
I'll tell you a
there's
little
a couple
story.
things. Yes.
So when I was starting to write fiction again seriously about 14, 15 years ago, I'd written some before, not published any successfully, but I was reading Caitlin Kiernan and Laird Barron, particularly John Lang, some of the writers who were just sort of had come to prominence in that first decade of the century in writing weird fiction. And Caitlin Kiernan explicitly says, and I when I wrote that little manifesto for my own use, I quoted her in that. She talks about scouting actual locations, and she does that. She goes out and scouts locations. So I was doing that, I think, already, but I began consciously doing it there. But what actually got me started where I am now is I'd gotten to John when I first met John Payne. I talked about that. I said, who's the best writer coming up now in weird fiction? And without hesitation, he said Laird Barron. And this was maybe around 2008. And Laird had one collection. The second one was just about the drop, or whatever time this was. Right. And so I immediately got the Imago sequence and was blown away by that. And Facebook was pretty new then, and it wasn't so toxic as it is now. And I got to know Laird on Facebook, and then his second book came out, and there's a scene. I think it's not the Men from Porlock. It's the God. I have to pick up the book.
Broadmoor.
No, it's the one where the guys get in a bar fight and then they go hide out in the woods.
Oh yeah. The one where they find the black guide.
Yeah.
I know exactly the story you're talking about. It's
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
There's one more. There's more than one black guide story. I will tell you that. And Langan uses it as well, and I think Paul does too.
Well, I actually sort of used it in the first story in my new book too. I sort of combined it with a real thing, which is the crew change that freight train riders use. It's like a secret book that freight train riders have, and you're not allowed to sell it for more than $10. You can't put it. You can't find it online. Whenever it goes online, it gets taken down immediately.
I'm so terrible with remembering titles, but I was rereading a few months ago his story involving the black guide, where these four guys go out in the woods camping, and then of course it's one of the biggest mistakes they've ever made.
Right. And, well, I think that's the one we're talking about.
Oh, is it? Yeah, they didn't. Yeah,
I think there was more than four guys.
They didn't get into a fight though. It was two gay couples.
Yeah, that's it. They got in a bar fight, and there's the line. They really beat the crap out of these.
That's okay. Guys. You're right.
That's one of his great lines.
It's almost nothing to do with the rest of the story, except it humanizes these men for us.
Yes, absolutely. I remember that scene now. And that is such
an atmospheric story. One of the characters says to the other, he says, "You wrecked those guys." Like they had done serious physical damage to the guys. So they go in the woods. Anyway, there's a scene in that story, and it ties into his later novella, The Men from Porlock. It's they pass the setting like that ruined village with like a small castle, and it's all burnt. And it's it's somewhere out in the middle of nowhere in the North Woods. So I messaged. I don't think I think I actually posted on Facebook, you know, to Laird. I said, so I just read that story, and I was wondering if this is one of those real weird locations that you've talked about. Is that a real place? It really had the feeling of a real place he'd seen. And he said no. But he said, you know, the one that he had encountered in real life is, you know, he ran the Iditarod, I think 3 times. And there's a place there where there's a series of wooden pylons, you know, near the trail. And it's that the dogs would get very uncomfortable in that place. And the indigenous people whose village was further down the trail would say, never, ever camp there. And I think he asked me, you know, have you ever encountered any real weird places? And I said, yeah, I did. There's a cave on Easter Island that I was in. And it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever experienced in my life. And he
And you
said,
wrote a book about it.
yeah, he said, you should write it. So I wrote up like a maybe 2,000 word description of these actual events. And he goes, you should make a story out of that. And then about 6 months later, I had a novella out of that. And that, yeah, that was the title story of my first book. But that's based on the final cave in the story is a real cave in almost all particulars. And when I was back there on a cave survey expedition in 2009, I could not find that cave. Even though we were right all over the area where that cave it was, I could not find it again.
It's like the Eric Zahn house.
Yeah.
Not able to ever find it. I looked it up. It's in occultation, and it's Mysterium Tremendum.
Mysterium, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just read it like 3 months ago, reread it for like the 3rd time. So
yeah, it's a great novella.
So Laird, don't kill me for this, but yeah, and by the way, occultation, the title story, I wrote about that in Lovecraft Easing about a year ago, just as an aside. It's one of 3 stories that I know about that it takes a setting of 2 people just in bed, you know, talking or whatever, and makes it into something horrifying or weird or strange or creepy. And occultation does that by Laird Barron. The other 2 stories are Jeffrey Ford's The Bedroom Light, which is in, let's see, The Drowned Life, his collection, The Drowned Life. And Ray Bradbury's, probably could be Ray Bradbury's scariest short story. It's not in a lot of his collections, but it's in what is it in? It's in the Stories of Ray Bradbury, the one which sounds like there could be many collections called that, but that's what this one's literally called. And the name of the story is Gotcha. And I read that as a kid, and I've never been so creeped out in my life. But you know, my point is that Laird and Bradbury and Jeff Ford took this very simple, ordinary, you know, setting and made it into something horrifying. So you know, that takes talent.
Master storytelling.
Yeah. So
well, Larry, I owe a great deal to Laird. Of course, he wrote the introduction for my first book, and it's been a huge inspiration. You know, yeah. I don't think I would have started. The impact of reading his writing for the first time was equivalent to reading Jean Ray, you know, for the first time a decade or so earlier.
That's a huge compliment.
And it's one of the things that made me want to write, although I didn't think I could do anything on that scale. And for a while, he would. I mean, one of the rudest things you can do to a writer is send them your stuff and ask them to read it, you know, unasked. But Laird invited me to send. Once I had written the whole 20-some thousand word novella on a kite, he offered to read it for me. He gave me great suggestions that improved the story, and he wrote. He read. He was like my first reader for most of the stories in the first book for quite some.
Yeah, he's a good friend, and I don't think even he realizes how many people he's influenced with his writing.
He's influenced, and he's raised people up. I mean, he's out there. You know, I remember the first time people are messaging me, did you see what Laird mentioned you? You know, and there were several times before the book came out that he said, "Oh, Scott Nicolay, something positive." And he did a few years ago. He did it again. But I owe Laird a great deal, and I'll never ever forget that.
Yeah, I'm working on sort of. I said to Laird, it's a fictional biography, I guess you could say, of the cult I grew up in. And I said my goal is to write it so that there are a lot of weird things that happen. In fact, in Mysterium Tremendum, of all stories, since we just mentioned it, one character talks about being raised Pentecostal, and he says, "You have any idea what that's like? I've seen things that you wouldn't believe." And I thought when I read that line, I told Laird this: "What about being raised Pentecostal, but a step further in a cult?" And he laughed, and I think he asked why I mentioned it, and I said, I said, "This is what I'm working on." I said, "My goal is to make it so these people ask themselves this weird thing that happens in the book, did this really happen or not? Because there'll be things in there that really happen that maybe they won't believe." And he said, "Yes, send it to me when you've made some progress." I thought
Cool.
that was really nice of him. So, because you're right, it's a very rude thing to do, to even say, "Can I send you this?" Because then they're in a spot where they don't want to be rude either, but it's a lot of work to read another.
It is, and we all have. I mean, the two things you get asked to do as a writer: A is to read, other people's stuff for them, and B is to write other people's stuff for them.
Yeah.
God forbid you're at a party and someone's drunk and they say, "Oh, I have this great idea for a book, and you should write it for me." And like, I've once spent like an hour trying to disengage myself from a friend's husband, who had this great idea for a novel.
I get a lot of emails from people saying, it would really mean a lot to me if you read my book and, tell me what you think of it and everything. And, you're caught between this feeling of you do want to help people. And
Yeah.
like you said, you do want to raise them up. And I try to do that. On the other hand, my TBR is huge as it is, and I add another book to it. It's a lot of work.
It is.
So
And
yeah,
I don't wanna
never
sound
ask an author, especially.
Yeah, it's just an etiquette thing. I don't want to sound aloof or snotty, and
No,
blame
and
other
it's
people
easy to
who've read
do.
my stuff.
When you say these things, it's easy to come off that way, and that's why I said I do want to help people, but
Yeah.
it's just, there's a difference between maybe asking me to read a short story or to read a novel, for example. So so when an author does, or someone in the community does offer, they're doing a very kind thing.
Exactly.
And Laird is a kind person.
That's why I was, was and remain so grateful to Laird that he did that for me.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, some people do that and they're just kind of green, and they just want some help. But a lot of them are the same people that will submit to, there'll be a call for submissions, and they'll say, "Okay, we only want, writers from a certain category," right? And they'll say, "Can you make an exception for me? I have this story that I've sent out 30 times." Every editor's, I'm sure you've gotten those things too.
Yeah.
And every poor editor who, ever puts out a call for submissions with any kind of limitations, immediately the first people that write in are like, "I'm a middle-aged white man, and I know you're only looking for Black authors, but I thought maybe I had this story that no one would publish. You can take it."
Or
These
you're
are the
looking
same
for a
people
certain
who want you
kind
to
of
do that
story,
stuff.
and like say weird fiction or
Right.
or cosmic horror, and they send you a ghost story.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of
There's
thing.
always that one person. So there's a mix. I mean, there are innocent, people that are just kind of starting out that are just looking for help. Sometimes they'll
Right.
ask for help, and then others are just the ones who are just constantly intrusive. Anyway, it's not a huge problem, but it is an etiquette thing that I think people ought to be aware of.
Well, I've been yelled at and cursed at a few times because I, as politely as I could, said, "I don't have time to do that right now. I'm sorry." And, suddenly I was the worst person in the world.
Yeah, and then you can tell the difference between somebody who's just innocently looking for help and somebody who's probably done this other times. And everybody is out here writing, I mean, I'm not at the highest level. I mean, I'm writing in my non-existent spare time. But everybody has their readers already, and everybody reads for somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, Anya Martin and I read each other's stuff for each other, and then we usually have a second or third person too. But we're usually, we trade off.
Well, years ago, I did this thing for a few months. 5 favorite weird tales, 5 favorite cosmic horror tales, whatever. And when I got to you, you chose A Tropical Horror by William Hope Hodgson.
Still favorite, yeah.
The genre story that you mentioned, I can't pronounce this.
The Centipede.
Okay, there you go. I can pronounce the Centipede.
Yeah.
The Dead Valley by Ralph Adams Cram. A Bit of the Dark World by Fritz Leiber. And this is an excellent, sorry, my brain does this, into what we're going to talk about next. The Pile of Sand by John Kefauver, which never heard of him until I talked to you on the phone last night. And you just edited a book of his stories. So I'd like to finish up with this real quick.
That'd be great.
And yeah, this is another one that a lot of people don't know about, that you're trying to bring to the forefront and make more people aware of. And you told me that I don't think you made a dime out of doing this.
I didn't.
You just did it because you thought it needed to be done, which I highly respect. I mean, we all should get paid for what we do, right? But doing it just because it's a labor of love, that I've got a lot of respect for that too. You sent me over the PDF last night, and I did read The Pile of Sand, which I liked it a lot. And what you said was well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that's an example of weird fiction, where less is more.
Yeah, that's what I said. So you're taking the words out of my mouth.
Okay. So talk about this book and this gentleman. The name of the book is.
I'll hold up since you don't have a physical. It's called Research into Marginal Living. There's his photo, Mr. Kefauver. He was apparently quite the stud in his day.
Edited by Scott Nicolay and introduced folks by Joe Lansdale.
Yeah, and Joe was one of the last editors who published his stories before he kind of retired from writing. In reading and doing the work for this, the editing work and doing the research, I found the very enthusiastic intros that Joe had written for Kefauver's stories. So I reached out to him and said, "Look, I'm doing this. I wonder if you'd be interested in writing an intro." And he immediately said yes, and he wrote a great intro.
Well, part of what he wrote was this. Speaking of Kefauver, and this is Joe Lansdale. These are Joe Lansdale's words. He wrote about bears who watch TV, as well as unidentified flying objects that doubled as swimming pools. The best thing about John is he could make the most ridiculous ideas seem logical, at least for the duration of the story. He had things to say, and I could tell you what I think they were saying, but instead of my stuffy explanations of what he meant, that in the end might be dead wrong, it's best for you to read the stories and decide for yourself. The thing is, you'll leave happily mystified, like discovering aliens had been living in your basement all along. Also want to mention that while this is not on Kindle, I looked at it's published by Lethe Press, Lethe, and if you look at Amazon or Barnes and Noble, it's $20. But if you go to Lethe Press, and I'll include the link, it's on sale for $15, which is a very reasonable price for what this book is.
30 stories.
Yeah.
With scholarly annotations for people who are into that.
Yeah. So talk about this book. Talk about what kind of writer this guy was, and we'll close up with that.
He's pretty unique. I discovered him. Maybe Matt would like to hear this too. So I discovered him back also in the 70s. I used to read those old Alfred Hitchcock anthologies, right, which were actually edited by the great Robert Arthur, who wrote some amazing fiction himself.
He wrote a really great weird fiction story called Footsteps Invisible. Remember that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the one, oh God, I'm blanking on every name today. I think we all are.
Plus he wrote The Three Investigators, if you
Yes,
remember those as
exactly.
a kid.
Yeah.
So
And I didn't know it at the time when I was reading his books too as a kid. And I didn't know that he lived, about an hour from me when I was growing up. I wish I'd known that. I would have found a way to meet him maybe. But
yeah.
anyway, so these Hitchcock anthologies, I ran across one. This would have been like, I don't know, 1974, and it had a story called "How Henry J. Littlefinger Licked the Hippies' Plot to Take Over the Country by Putting Pot in Postage Stamp Food." And at the time, my big thing was Mad Magazine. I was like deeply into Mad Magazine,
Yeah.
and it would soon graduate to Monty Python. But I saw that.
There you go, Carpenter.
I
You
saw.
like Monty Python. You're always quoting Monty Python.
Actually, I loved Mad Magazine. I'd get copies and read them and read them and read them until they fell apart. I tried to look at it for my kids when they were like 5 or 6, and it no longer worked because the internet is so broad and vast and deep. Everybody's introduced to parody and satire at a young age. And Mad Magazine is like one of the first exposures of pop culture satire that a lot of us had as little kids. So they got progressively more vulgar. Like one of their jokes was some guy who got the wrong magazine. It was Chicks with Ducks. Okay, so I immediately scooped that magazine up and would let my kids read it at age 5, 6, 7, whenever I was reading Mad. It just got very went to try and.
Now I remember a copy I bought in like 1975 or something, and it had on the cover, it had a parody of Cosmo. It was a magazine, it had magazine parodies, and on the cover of the Cosmo parody was "Artificial Insemination: How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Syringe." And my mother saw that, and that was almost the end of my Mad Magazine career at the time.
I guess I don't remember from when I was younger. It seemed to me like to try and keep ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
they had gone away from their core humor. I don't know.
The only Mad Magazine I ever even looked at, and this was in a store, and it was because they did a Superman parody. This must have been somewhere around 78. So you remember in Superman the movie where he's about to turn back time and he hears his father's voice saying it is forbidden for you to interfere with human history and all that, and he's like looking around going, and which was to me a little overkill if he's just remembering. But so in Mad Magazine, they were like, whose were those voices? It was the voices of the producers telling him that he needs a sequel. So do it. That's the only thing I can bring to you about Mad Magazine. And then about Monty Python, Matt never stops talking about it. So
yeah. Anyway, that was
unending.
Mad Magazine was my thing back in the day. So I read that Kefauver story and I liked it. And so he became another, maybe after Lovecraft, only the second writer that I would search for his stories. So as each new Hitchcock anthology came out, I would look for his stories. And a couple years later, after reading that one, another Hitchcock came out and it had this story, The Pile of Sand, which was an incredible story and very different from the one I'd read earlier. And it had another story called Special Handling about a postman who is delivering these packages to this mailbox, on a dead end road. And every time he goes, the mailbox in the house gets smaller.
Wow. That's cool.
That's also a genuine weird story. It's a rare example of a funny weird story that actually works. And that's in the book too. But I always look for Kefauver after that. And I always expected, soon you'll have a novel out. I mean, this guy's great, and the novel never came out. And I learned eventually, as you said, I wrote him a letter. Palin and I actually had that idea, and we were going to maybe do a print on demand of one of his books. And he wrote back and wasn't much interested. And I let it go at that point. And then a few years later, I got a call from his niece saying that he had died, but his landlady found the letter on his desk. And she said, "Do you still want to do this?" And I said, "Yeah." And it took me 2 years to find a publisher who was interested, which is Steve Berman's Lethe Press. And he was actually originally interested in the one novel. He published only 2 novels. One was a softcore porn novel in the 60s, around the same time as that John Ray's Ghouls in the Grave came out in 1964. I mean, it's not porn by today's standards, even remotely. And it's an interesting novel because all the characters are non-binary, and so it doesn't use that language. It wasn't
Really?
at that time. So that's what Steve wanted to publish, and we published that in a scholarly edition, so that it could be used in college classes on gender studies, and then we did the book of fiction. But anyway, it turned out that his nieces lived in New Jersey, and so when I would go out east to visit my family, I would drive down there and go through the files. They had saved all his files; they were going to get thrown out. And he had files of every story he'd sold back to the 60s. I was able to find in editing the book a few that weren't in his notes even earlier.
They were going to get thrown out.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
He had a
Wow.
record of, so they brought back a whole file cabinet full of stuff and other memorabilia and everything. I should probably get to work now on finding them a college library, that university library, that session. So I worked over the course of years, and finally during the pandemic finished it up, and a little behind the original schedule, but got it out. And it got a start review in Publishers Weekly, but it doesn't seem to be getting out to people, sadly.
Yeah, and last night I told you I wanted to make this appeal to my listeners. Look, we've talked about weird fiction, this whole episode, and this is another weird fiction book. And it was a labor of love on Scott's part. Pick up a copy and read it. It's going to be unlike anything you've read. It's you've got 2 thumbs up from Joe Lansdale, who I think everyone respects his opinion, but it's just not getting traction. So pick up a copy, and just as importantly, after you read it, review it on Amazon. Even if you pick up a copy at Lethe Press, which you should do because you're gonna save $5. After you read it, review it on Amazon, because unfortunately that's where a lot of people make their decisions, and that's where books get traction or fail to. So yeah, please do
I'd
that.
like to see it get out there more. I mean, it's not all weird fiction. His stories are, as Lansdale said in in what you read from the introduction, they're unique. He tends to operate in an area somewhere between weird and ribald and just completely offbeat, and a little bit of noir. And he sort of bounces around like a ping pong ball inside that framework, leaning more in one direction sometimes and more in another. But it's always in that area, and some unique combination of this.
Well, once again, because of you, I know about a writer. I didn't know about this writer before last night, but because of you, I know about a writer who I very much want to read. So I'm gonna pick up this book, and I can't say thank you enough for the Jean Ray translations. I mean that sincerely. These are just such incredible stories, and I'm sure the what's his name? I'm blanking on his name. I keep mispronouncing it. John. Yeah. And it's called, let's see, Research into Marginal Living: The Selected Stories of John D. Kefauver. I'm sure that these stories are going to be the same.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, he was back in the day in the 60s and 70s. He was regularly in the Pan books of horror, that came out in the UK, regularly in the Hitchcock anthologies. He was a fairly regular contributor to Omni, Playboy. He was getting in high venues, and then he had part of the thing is he never succeeded in getting an adult novel. He had that softcore porn novel in like the early 60s, and then which he actually published under his own name, which is bizarre. And then he had a young adult novel about a giant traffic jam, and these kids are trapped in the traffic jam. And it's actually quite good. It's just a short thing. But he had half a dozen adult novels, and he never landed one. And the first one, the stack of communication between him and agents and publishers is the same size as the manuscript of the novel. Like he came close again and again, and no one ever took it. It was just too offbeat. But it is weird, but not weird enough. It was freaky, but not freaky enough. It was sexy, but not sexy enough. And he went through that with 6 novels.
Well, again, I will include the link to that in the show notes, folks.
Thank you.
Research into Marginal Living: The Selected Stories of John D. Kefauver. Now, I want to finish with Scott by reading this. I received a review copy with that lovely cover.
Oh, I haven't seen one that looks like that.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. I don't mind. I love it, actually, because I'm
Hold
one
it
of
up,
the,
Mike. Hold it up again.
I'm one of the very few people who have one of these black.
The cool thing is, I don't know if you can
covers.
see the way where you're holding it up. The reflection actually looks like the actual cover.
Oh, really? I think that's my shirt.
Yeah, whatever's reflecting on it looks like the actual cover. That's pretty.
That's funny.
Eerie.
Well, listen to this.
It's a haunted object.
Yeah, listen to this, folks. A young drifter rides the rails through a landscape of monsters, human and otherwise. A trio of hikers find themselves trapped in an Arizona cave. Uncertain whether the greater threat lay outside or within, a man reunites with a childhood crush, but finds himself overwhelmed by memories he has repressed for years. A woman evades curfew and evacuation to remain in a hurricane-damaged town, but soon discovers she is not alone. So I really hope that whets your appetite for Scott's book. We've talked about other books too, but Scott's new collection, And At My Back, I Always Hear, by Scott Nicolay, available in print and in Kindle. So thanks, Scott, for everything.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's always great to talk to you in person or through the magic of the internet.
Well, this is the 3rd time I've said this in 2 days, I think, but I really cannot thank you enough for translating genre, and I love your work as well. That's a given, but I can't thank you.
That means a lot to me. I got my start. My first book happened because of you. You published one of my very first stories that I haven't republished. It's only on Lovecraft e-zine. And what's the name of it? I can't remember the name of anything today.
Anyway, me either.
So
but I'll tell you. I'll tell you in a second.
It was in your Innsmouth issue.
I can search my site, Nicolay. I think I would remember, but
it had a great illustration.
I published hundreds of stories. For those who don't know, I'm on to being a micropress and a podcaster and a few other things, but the e-zine is still there. You can go to lovecraftezine.com and click on Lovecraftian and weird, or excuse me, Lovecraft e-zine fiction archive. There it is. And you can read all these hundreds of weird fiction and Lovecraftian stories for free. So they're all on there.
Yeah, that one actually you had an audio recording of it too, and Nick Gucker did a great illustration.
Yes, he did. I've got it in front of me, and it's called Alligators.
No, that's not the one.
That's not the one?
That's not the one. That's
not the one that got you the...
No, Alligators is actually in my first book too. But you published, I think, 2 of mine. Alligators.
I must have published 2.
Yeah, also with a great Nick Gucker, really fantastic Nick Gucker illustration. I have the original, so I bought it from him. But the other one, the first one, after you published it, it got some nice comments, and I don't know, maybe like the 5th or 6th comment.
Oh, in the tank.
In the tank. There we go. Thank you for remembering the story I wrote.
I'm sorry, I have hundreds of them in my head. Yeah, In the Tank. That's the one that that got you the
Yeah.
book
And
contract.
I saw one of the comments, I recognized the name of a publisher, and I thought, and he expressed interest in other stories. So I thought, oh my God, I've hooked the big fish here. And I reached out, and that was Dennis Weiler from Fedogan and Bramer,
Yep.
published my first book, and would have done my second, but they're on hiatus, or have been.
They publish beautiful books too. Those books are meant to last.
What I'm happy about is, I worked with Ross, Ross Lockhart. So the second book, the one we've been talking about, has the same cover artist, and David Verba, and the same designer, Michaela Waltz, as the first book. So they match. I'm happy about that, because it was kind of really fun to work with. It was a collaborative effort working with them on the first book, and we were able to do it again. So.
And here is the Nick Ducker illustration for In the Tank by Scott Nicolay.
Yeah, Nick is such a great artist.
He really is.
He did the logo for The Outer Dark too. I think he illustrated 3 of my stories, 2 for you, and I guess 1 somewhere else. And at some point I said, the next time we work together on something, I want Lee Brown koi sticks in the image. And so when he did the Outer Dark logo, he designed it with the Lee Brown koi sticks.
Well, he did. Like I said, I wouldn't call myself a small press. I'm more of a micro press. But you can find those at Lovecraft Easing too. I just was lucky enough to publish a Michael Sisko book, and Nick Ducker did the cover for that. He was so excited to do the cover for a Michael Sisko book, and he did the cover for The Sea of Ash by Scott Thomas. And
oh, it's so much fun, that book. The haunted bushel basket is one of my favorite things.
Oh yes,
weird fiction. Every time I see Scott Thomas, like the haunted bushel, one of my favorite things in weird fiction.
We see what he usually gets is Harry, I forget the character's name, the ghost Harry, from the story.
If we're kind of wrapping up, you did mention one thing though I don't think we've talked about on this podcast, but if you could just talk for like 2 minutes about the Outer Dark podcast, because that's an important venue, and I don't think we brought it up.
No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing it myself anymore. Anya Martin took over for me, because I am trying to finish up my dissertation right now. It's a little too much, but we started that. I don't know how long ago. It's quite a while ago. Maybe might be as much as 8 years ago. And I was inspired to do it when I was at a World Horror Convention, and there were several panels that actually Anya had played a big role in organizing. One in particular that had all the not all, but it had a cast of writers from the Black Specklet community, and I was just so impressed by the way that they were building community there, whereas in weird fiction people were fighting each other, trying to play gatekeeper. But in the Black Specklet community, people were lifting each other up, and right, like in this panel, they were literally, people in the audience would engage with the panel, and I met a lot of folks that are my friends now, for the first time, Linda Addison and Davis at Hall. And I thought it would be great to have something like that in weird fiction. And it just happened that what was called Project iRadio, I don't know what they're called now, was interviewing writers at this convention, at the World Horror Convention. And they asked me if I wanted to do an interview. So I did an interview, and at some point during the interview, the fellow, I can't remember his name now, the fellow was interviewing me, he said, somebody's done radio before, which I had done quite a bit of back in college days. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, if you ever, he said, let's do another, like a fuller interview later on, over online, after this is over. So we did that. And at the end of that, he said, if you ever think of an idea for a podcast, let me know. And about 15 minutes later, I emailed him and said, how about a podcast where I interview other weird writers? And he said, that sounds great. And he said, come up with a name. And then I emailed him about 5 minutes later and said, how about The Outer Dark?
Yeah, I love that name.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Cormac McCarthy novel, but it shows up elsewhere too. It is Cormac McCarthy didn't invent it. Not that I'm unhappy with that association.
Yeah,
it's kind of the way I think of the weird. When I'm writing, I have this this sort of image in my head that it's night and I'm out in this sort of swamp or a bog, and there's like an abandoned factory, and I go into that factory, and it's, you know, it's all desolate, and there's like some dirty window that looks out over a deeper part of the swamp that you can't access any other way, and I scrape off a little bit of that scum on the window, and I peer through there, and whatever I write each night is what I see through that little window.
That is amazing, Scott.
So that's
I
you know, I'm looking into
love
the
that.
Underdark.
I love that. I've never heard anything like that before. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real thing.
That's amazing. Anya's still doing the Outer Dark, right?
Yeah, she's doing a fantastic job. I think she's done more episodes than I did now. I think so, and she's continuing to promote. You know, I mean, what we started with the Outer Dark is we wanted to lift up authors that we thought deserved more attention.
Right.
You know, not that they were completely obscure, but I think the first person I interviewed was Livia Llewellyn. That was like immediately my first choice, and and maybe the first three were like first four I think were Livia Llewellyn, Jayprakash Satyamurthy, Cheshire Burke, and John Langan. John Langan, I think, was sort of, you know, he was you know, more well known than others, and Livia was already getting. The idea was always to promote writers. So people would say, "Why don't you, you know, you could interview so and so, you know, famous writer, you know," and I could have maybe gotten that interview, but I'm like, that person's doing fine on their own.
Right.
Yeah. So it's always about. I feel like, and I think you're doing the same thing, Mike. I mean, once you have some kind of platform established, and you know, when I won the World Fantasy Award, that gave me a certain standing. It's not huge, but it gives me a sort of fixed place that I can speak from, some level of credibility, you know, small as it is. And creating the podcast, you have a platform. I think your role is to, I mean, once you get in the door, a foot in the door, whatever, keep that door open and let as many other people in as possible.
Right.
And again, that's what I saw the folks from the Black science fiction community doing. I thought, this is, you know, what we need to do in weird fiction.
Yeah, it's if you're doing it right, it can't be about you. It's supposed to be about the guest and the people that you're trying to lift up, and as well as, and I try to do this, and we have a lot of fun doing it, as well as us just chatting about the latest horror and all that too. But with the guest, yeah, and if they are somewhat well known, you know, maybe somebody else doesn't know about them, or maybe they know about them, but they haven't thought about that author in a while, and that author's got a new book, and they're like, "Oh, right, I like John Langan. I need to pick this up," that sort of thing.
Yeah.
As well as the writer that nobody's ever heard of that is doing excellent work, or artist, or a creator, or whatever.
And it's exciting to see people, you know, I mean, I won't take credit for starting anybody's career. Everybody, you know, they've had on has obviously had a book out or something ready. It's exciting to see people that, you know, I've interviewed, excuse me, or that Anya's interviewed, and see them, you know, getting bigger and bigger.
Every little bit helps.
I think it's a community, and I think we all have, you know, we should all work to build that community together.
Yeah. Well, you know, I agree. Thank you for being here, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
That and it's and at my back, I always hear by Scott Nicolay, and of course the genre books and the John Favreau book. Still saying it wrong, but I'll link to all of those.
Thank you.
And we're gonna talk for just about 5 or 10 more minutes. You're welcome to stay or go, whatever you want to do. If you got a busy day, then you can log out. So totally up to you. So, but either way, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks again.
Somebody asked, a listener asked about wanting to know our 5 favorite horror movies, and on the next podcast. And I said yes, but I'm going to say we'll do it next week because more of us will probably be here.
And I gotta say, this kind of question, there's no answer. It's like,
well, how about your current favorites? Is that a better question?
Or just, I don't know, because the older I get, the more I've seen, the more I've read, the more mature I get, or more jaded. I don't know.
Grouchy.
it's like I can no longer go back and say I've got a favorite just about anything, favorite song.
Do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite podcast?
Well, no.
I didn't think so.
It's like I just find this. It was more when I was young. I had, this is my band, and this is their best song, and this is my author, and that's my favorite story by them. And it's like, well, I'm looking for something new. I do remember reading those stories; they were good.
All right. Well, if you're done yelling at clouds, we're going to do this next week, and you can include your favorites or not, whatever you want to do.
I've got 5 to mention. It's
Okay.
just,
There you go.
are they favorites? I don't know.
I hear what Matt's saying. I have one of my best friends ever. In fact, my friend that I dedicated my first book to, and he constantly will text me. He texts usually me and his brother and a couple other guys, and he say, "Okay, I need to know your top 5 Cronenberg movies ranked in order.
Oh,
by
jeez.
by 15 minutes from now. Or top 5 Beatles songs or whatever."
Well, favorites change, and maybe look at it this way, Matt. This person, and I know many other listeners want to know this from us. 5 good horror movie recommendations from you. Does that frame it better for you?
I've got 5 movie recommendations. I don't know if they're good.
Do you think they're good?
They were important.
You see what I'm dealing with, Scott? You see what I have to deal with?
Saying it's like, okay, like Dracula from 1931 or whatever, 33, it had so many problems. But when I saw it, I was 5. And the count coming in with the music of Swan Lake playing and Renfield.
Okay, we're done with this question right now. We're done with this.
When you're 5, Plan 9 from Outer Space was great.
Yes.
Yeah, it was good. What are you talking about?
All right. So
I loved it as a kid when I first saw it.
Nathan Ballingrad tweeted the other day that he had been constantly thinking lately about a movie that he saw years ago called The Reflecting Skin.
Oh yeah.
I had never even heard of it.
With Viggo Mortensen.
Yes, Viggo Mortensen's in it, and apparently it's a beautiful, creepy, sad movie. I'm going to be watching it tomorrow, and I'm really looking forward to it. But I'm going to go ahead and mention it because everyone I've talked to that's seen it has loved it, and I really respect Nathan's opinion.
Yeah, Nathan
as well. So yeah, so
he
check
did
this out.
a nice blurb for my book. So yeah, he has very good taste.
So The Reflecting Skin, check that movie out. So let's see here. Here's some good news. The Kindle version of The Autopsy and Other Stories by Michael Shea is now available. So the Kindle version wasn't there for a while, and it is there now. So you can pick that up on Kindle if you want. Thought that was an important thing to say. I've got something really cool that I like, that I thought was a really fun idea. I mean, Lovecraft Easing Book Club. Our first book is Lucky Girl by M. Rickert. She's going to be our guest next week. And so I'll link to that as well. We've got about 26, 27 members already, but obviously not everybody that follows me knows about it yet. So I'll link to that. It's on Amazon. It's a pretty cool setup. It does all the hard work for me. So
one thing that you mentioned to me, Mike, a
yes.
week or 3 ago is a podcast called It Grows Dark, which is basically a storytelling of something bad that happened in Antarctica.
I did.
You mentioned it, and I started listening to it, and so far there's one 5-minute intro episode and one 25-minute episode. It's not that it's not worth listening to, but it really seems to be coming along very, very slowly.
I don't remember mentioning this.
You sure did.
And I might have passed it on. I haven't
Right.
listened to it.
You may not have listened to it yourself.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not interesting, but it's kind of hard to recommend when it doesn't seem to be being added to more frequently than once every month or so.
All right. Well, that's really good to know because I don't want to recommend crap to people.
We'll see when if they keep going and where the story goes. But right now, it's like there's not much substance there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're going to start some, you have a responsibility to add content, or otherwise don't start it.
It's like, I don't know. It's like we watched those Lovecraft and Tesla comics that came out. The guy said we have 54 planned. It's nah,
Yeah. Right. Joe Pulver was just excited as hell about this book. If he mentioned it to me once a week, he mentioned it to me 5 times a week. The Leaves of a Necronomicon, and it's a wonderful book. It's only out on Kindle right now, but it is coming out in print.
It is now available in print. You can order it from Amazon.
Oh, okay. I thought I looked yesterday and it wasn't. Maybe I'm wrong.
I just
ordered 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Okay. Well, I'm really wrong then.
But
I'm glad.
Kowski says there's, I think it's called Sisterhood. There's another anthology just released by Chaos. What's that?
It's that's the title, Sisterhood.
It's I think it's Lovecraftian cultist type stuff, but all women authors.
Released by who?
That's what the theme is.
It's all Chaosium. It's a new Chaosium book.
Okay. Yeah, because Chaosium is
books. Culver and Sisterhood.
Yeah, Leaves of Necronomicon was published by Chaosium too. So okay, I see the segue. Let's see here. All right, look, I'm gonna try this. Kelly Young, he's got a degree, he went to film school, something. And I'm so much more right than he is about movies. It's incredible. I give him shit like this all the time to his face. So he's a really good friend, as everyone knows. So we give each other shit all the time. So he tells me that I need to keep watching Nope. It's on Peacock now for you to watch if you have Peacock. So I started watching it and I texted him and I said, first 30 minutes, I said, this is like watching horses watch paint dry. And he's like, well, keep on it. It's a slow burn, which a couple of other people said to me. So I'm gonna keep watching it, but I'm gonna have to make myself. Damn it!
It's really good and it's really weird.
Okay, then
I gotta talk to you about it after you watched it because I had to talk with friends for a while about the so-called framing story that happened in one of the characters' past.
All right, you've convinced me. I'll finish it tonight.
You seem to think it has nothing to do with the rest of the story. It's about a kid who is a former child
Yeah,
star.
I've met that kid, but that don't know much about him yet.
Right.
Child
So
star.
what happens to him has a direct effect on the story. You just don't realize it.
All right, I'll finish watching it tonight so that we can talk about it.
It's also thematically linked to what actually turns out to be going on.
Right.
All right, now you guys have really convinced me.
Seriously. It's extremely well crafted and nuanced film, and it gets a lot wilder and a lot more exciting.
Young has been known to be right on occasion before. I like to insult him on the show just to see if he listens, So, anyway, of course I insult him in person and he doesn't listen to that. So anyway, we were also talking about Smile. And I was like, I really love that movie. And he's like, that movie is a piece of crap. It's derivative and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, Kelly, answer me something. Did you watch the trailer before you watched the movie? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, well, I watched the trailer after I watched the movie. And I can see why you don't like the movie because it gives away 3/4 of everything in the trailer. So why would you be impressed by the movie? And he still didn't agree with me, but no surprise. Which brings up, I said, you need to stop if you want to watch a movie trailer for an action movie or a drama or a comedy, I get that, but to watch a horror trailer, to me, they just give too much away these days. If a good horror trailer is like, remember the trailer for The Last Wave?
Yeah.
Very, very eerie, just a little bit about what's going on, but you're not really sure. You're just like, wow, this looks really weird. I gotta watch this. This is the feeling you get from the trailer of The Last Wave. It starts off with this eerie music and the announcer going, hasn't the weather been strange? And that, anyway, that's a good movie trailer. But what I want to say about Smile is that I really enjoyed it. I watched it in the dark at night, which you should always do, and I was very disturbed. And I don't scare easily, and it was, yeah. But Smile, the movie Head Count, and the movie It Follows, they both have something in common, which, unless you've watched all three, I can't really mention. But if you've seen all three of those movies, then you know what I'm talking about. A Head Count is a movie that I would never have watched if somebody hadn't said, hey, this is a really good movie. I forget who, but somebody whose opinion I respect, because it's basically about these college kids who are on a spring break or something and rent a house in the desert, and they're drinking and playing games and stuff, which is not really my type of movie, but it's a lot better than it sounds, a lot better. But Smile and Head Count and It Follows, which is a brilliant movie, the best of the three, no doubt. But they've got something in common that if you've seen all of them, I would really be interested in talking with anyone who's seen all three of them, and what, if you agree with me that they do have that in common. So I guess that's all I can say about it. There's going to be a Welcome to Derry Stephen King TV series. So I don't know. What was that Hulu series?
Castle
That's
Rock.
It was terrible.
Never watched it. I never watched The Dome either.
I didn't watch the Dome either. I tried reading the Dome, and I love Stephen King, but I just couldn't get into it. But
I gave up on the Dome after the first season.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has got a lot of potential, Welcome to Derry, but I mean, I sure as hell hope it's a lot better than Castle Rock.
But it'd be great if they mashed it up with Dairy Girls.
Derry Girls. Okay, good. You went there. Last but not least, here's a funny story. I know you're ready to go, Matt, so you're rolling your eyes at me.
Well, the fact that you're saying that it's funny, I do the humor here. You don't.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's what my wife and my son say too, that I'm not funny. So, but this is funny because it's not me telling it. Danielle told it to me. So she goes to this pharmacist, elderly guy, yesterday to ask him about something with me and my multiple plethora of conditions in my body that go wrong. I think I just off the assembly line, my chassis broke or something. But so she mentions it, and he goes, that sounds a lot like caused by stress. And she's like, yeah, that's what I thought too, and blah blah blah. And she's talking to him and teasing him like she always does. Everybody loves Danielle. And he's like, yeah, well, I believe it. He goes, I've been talking with you for 5 minutes, young lady, and I'm already stressed out. So he was kidding though. So but I just thought it was funny. So did Danielle. So all right, what's the prize that you're anxious, because you got to go cook dinner for everybody, right?
I gotta get things ready. It's Scott Thomas again, Veil of the White Horse. If you want to win this book, and I recommend you enter to win it. If you don't win it, you should buy it. Send an email to ezineprizes@gmail.com and put Veil in the subject heading. We will draw a winner sometime around Christmas.
easingprizes@gmail.com, not to me, please. And important question, do you have to enter to win?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
otherwise,
that's what I thought.
I take, like, what you do is, like, when it's time to win, if I get, say, 8 entries, I go to the site random.org, where it's a true random number generator. I put in the numbers 1 to 8, say it pops out 5, I count down from the top. The 5th person gets the prize.
I taught him that, Scott, just so you know. So he has learned at least one thing from me in all these years.
Our 5th caller here on the Night Wire.
Exactly.
As our 5th caller here on the Night Wire will win this exciting collection by Scott Thomas.
A
But
fine,
Anyway,
genuinely
yes.
fine writer.
it
He
happens
really,
like 6
really
weeks down the
is.
pipe.
Yeah.
So
And if you
plenty
like
of
the
time
Sea
to
of
learn.
Ash, you should check out the Audible version. Lehman Thomas did a great job. So, but anyway, thanks for being here, Scott Nicolay. Again, the book is at my back, I always hear, by Scott Nicolay, not Scott Thomas. And Rick and Matt, thanks for being here. And next week, as I said, Mary Rickard is our guest, and we'll be talking about her new book, Lucky Girl. Yeah.
Right.
So thanks, guys, and we will